Hello and welcome to the Hacking State podcast. This is your host, Alex Mershak. With me today is Lomez, the Honorable Lomez, who kindly enough has put on and promoted the Passage Prize, the famed Passage Prize, as well as the Passage Press, and the works that have come out of that. Lomez, welcome to the show. So good to have you.
Hey Alex, thanks for having me on, man. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for coming. So to get started, obviously a number of listeners are going to be familiar with the Passage Prize, but maybe not everybody who's hearing this. So can you just give me a little bit of the background on how the Passage Prize came to be established? What were the motivations behind it, and what did it ultimately turn into?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably if I was going to go back and pinpoint where this all started, it was in 2020, fall of 2020. Everybody was kind of scattered to the winds from COVID and, spending a lot of time online on Twitter. And I've been online forever. Way back in the day, I was on forums back in the late aughts and early 2010. So it's a scene I've been around for a long time.
Mhm.
And I was around this scene, for the first election cycle, of course, the first Trump election cycle, of course. And one thing that started to become increasingly clear was that there was some kind of intellectual, sort of artistic, cultural energy forming in this online anonymous space that
Mhm.
was distinct from a kind of leftist sort of hipster version of that. So like the left had their own kind of online discursive economy and culture, subculture that was forming, but there wasn't really much happening on the right that had much of a cultural dimension. And so in 2020, I read an article by Mike Anton
Mhm.
and actually had a conversation with him elsewhere where we were talking about this problem of the absence of culture on the right, broadly speaking. And this is something that anybody who's been paying attention, has noticed for decades, at least in the course of my lifetime. There's never existed anything remotely close to a robust and vibrant, kind of even conservative coded, like right of center at all culture.
Mhm.
And there was the question of why there was this absence of culture on the right. I mean, you have like filmmakers, for example, like Mel Gibson, or I would argue even some of the stuff the Coen brothers do, despite whatever their stated politics might be. Cormac McCarthy novels or something, I would say are on the right in the most sort of general abstract sense. Um, but there was a question of why that was never directed in any kind of meaningful way, never cultivated in any kind of meaningful way. Sort of right wing artists had to be kind of ashamed of who they were or operate sort of in quiet in the dark. Okay, this is all a long way, long-winded way of saying that it was becoming increasingly clear to me there was an absence of some space where people who might have politics that are right of center or simply just weren't part of this kind of leftist hegemonic monoculture um, could ply their trade and share
Mhm.
their stories and share their art. And I was online, I thought, why not, let's try something here. And I thought I'll try a contest and we'll put up $10,000 worth of prizes. I figured that was enough to entice people off the sidelines.
Yeah.
Pardon me. And pretty soon we had raised enough money that we were able to offer 20K. And that generated, I think, a lot of interest, a lot of buzz. Um, and one thing kind of led to another. This thing just sort of snowballed, and we got a huge turnout for this prize. Tons of people submitting poetry and short stories and art and essays. I got some judges who I think helped me attract some attention, like Curtis Yarvin, Zero HP Lovecraft, and others. And so this was something that while I guess in some sense started it, it really like grew outside of my own sort of personal direction rather quickly. It became something that just sort of belonged to the community, and I was just there to kind of steward it along. And on the success of that first Passage Prize, we started a second one. We were able to sell a lot of books, and this gave rise to what I thought might be a nice follow-on project, which was to start a publishing company in the wake of the success of this contest. And that's kind of the origin story.
Yeah, I mean, I remember myself at the time. I was like, I didn't even start my first show until the beginning of 2020, so I was still mostly a lowly, uh, I wouldn't say anon because I wasn't anon, but I
Mm-hmm.
was like a lowly sued or like a
Uh-huh.
lowly shit poster, and I was so excited when the first Passage Prize was announced because, people have been talking for a long time about the lack of right wing cultural impact and about this like false narrative that exists, which is that there's no such thing as right wing art or right wing artists,
Right.
which is a total retcon by the left of the history of art and Western culture. But they've really, at least since probably the post-war period, totally erased, or at least heavily suppressed, any conception that there's a right-wing art tradition on
Yeah.
really every front.
So what's interesting though about that is, while the left is wrong in the broadest sense, they are kind of correct in some narrow sense that, as I was saying, again, at least for my lifetime, the sort of nominal right, whatever we saw as like the public instantiation of like right wing politics or like right wing culture really
Mhm.
did suck. I mean, it
Yeah,
was pretty bad and
it's still pretty
remains
cringe.
pretty bad on the whole. And I'm not going to pretend like there's some like vibrant conservative culture out there that, but for, the left like suppressing these great stories and ideas, would have some kind of large cultural presence. It really just doesn't exist. And I mean, it might be interesting to at some point, if not right now, although maybe right now, sort of interrogate why that is. Why is it that in this post-war period, conservative quote unquote art has been so bad? I mean, if you go back to, let's say, earlier in the 20th century,
Mhm.
and you look at the modernists, for example, Eliot and Pound or something,
Yeah,
these guys are certainly right. And the difference between them and the more modern version of like a conservative culture is they weren't afraid of art. The right in my lifetime has had this kind of prudish attitude towards culture and art. They're sort of afraid. I have a friend who said this to me often. Conservatives are afraid of the artistic gesture.
Mhm.
And I think what he means by that is that art is, in some sense, requires stepping into the unknown and doing something new and different.
Yeah,
And artists, conservative art in my lifetime has been always backwards looking. It's just sort of retracing these old modes and old ways of doing things. And of course, I love classical art and classical literature and classical music. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And we ought to embrace it and valorize it and celebrate it every chance we get. And in fact, use it as influence, for our own art. But art does have to speak to the time that you're in
yeah,
and help, sort of create a vision of what kind of society you want to live in, perhaps. Although I think it's simply enough to just look at the world honestly and say something honest about the world. But even that, I think, is in some sense and has been too raw for sort of conservatism of the kind you saw during like the 90s, Buckley conservatism. It's just
yeah.
boring. It doesn't have this kind of a spirit of aggression and, forwardness that
No,
I
it's
think art needs to have.
it's just not vital, right? I mean,
Yeah, right. To
that's
use
really
a
what it
word, I think
is.
that's exactly right.
It's
Yeah.
kind of stodgy and Um, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned earlier in the century the modernists. There was also, even Julius Evola was an artist. He did these Dadaist paintings,
Yeah.
and so in some of the early, even 20th century art movements that were avant-garde, there
Mhm.
were very right-wing people around. But I'm wondering if maybe the issue is actually the predominance of conservatism itself, as opposed to all other, you know, variations of right wing political thought that have sort of are basically like not allowed. Um, I'm not
Yeah.
sure. I think conservatism maybe itself is sort of inherently, uh, risk averse as you were describing it, and maybe has a hard time leading into anything that's too novel.
I think that's probably right. I mean, for all my posting online, I'm not really an ideologue in that sense where I could give you some clear accounting of the distinction between sort of right wing at large versus this more kind of contemporary conservatism, though I'm sure there's an important distinction to be made there. And I think this kind of contemporary conservatism that has come to dominate American politics and American life, at least up until like right this moment, where we might be on the at this hinge point for something new to emerge, really is just a kind of neutered, humorless, sexless liberalism
Mhm.
without any kind of like real other identifying features. I mean, its entire purpose was to achieve victory in the Cold War
Right.
by promoting, capitalism, sort of Koch brothers style libertarianism. And as much as I, in some sense, despise that as an ideology, as a way to think about the fullness of, society and the way we ought to be arranging ourselves politically, I have to hand it to them. They were successful. They won. You can. I mean, the commies are still around, right? We see them like every day trying to reassert themselves. But
Mhm.
these guys won the Cold War. There's no denying that.
Yeah.
So it worked. But now we're on the other side of it. So I think that's part of why we're now asking ourselves these questions. Okay, the Cold War's over. So now what? What does
Mhm.
this next thing look like? And the the narrowness of the kind of status quo anti-conservatism that we're graduating out of, um, just doesn't obtain anymore. And I think part of what will come next is going to be more capacious in the kinds of in its dimensions. It's not just going to be narrowly like this like homo economicus sort of guy, but it's going to take into account like art and culture and these other things that make us and make good lives and good society. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I know I'm speaking in a long-winded way here, but I think that's right. I just think that what we came out of was a very narrow conception of what sort of right-leaning politics is.
Yeah.
And
No,
so now we're rediscovering all the other parts of this terrain.
I think you're totally correct. I think that like what's coming and what people are in the process of trying to formulate right now is like a much more rich mixture of like there's a lot more humanistic elements involved. It's not as flat as before. It's not as not that economics doesn't matter, but like it turns out that if you just optimize for economics and you abandon all of the rest of culture, you end up losing anyway, which people are finding out now.
Right.
Um, and then your economic systems get co-opted regardless by the cultural elite. So I think we're actually moving into a very interesting space, and everyone's sort of trying to build that together, which I guess leads me to get deeper into the impact and the reception of especially the first Passage Prize, because it seems to me like the first Passage Prize was far more successful than perhaps you were expecting.
Oh yeah.
And I know you got inundated, and you still get inundated with tremendous amount of submissions. And so I just wanted to ask you, like, um, what kind of stuff came in that surprised you, and then what were you really like, especially for that first book? What were you really considering as far as filtering out the good from the bad for trying to formulate let's say, an identity
Yeah.
for the prize?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So, one is yes, I was sort of shocked is actually an understatement, to receive the kind of support and interest that that first prize did. I mean, we received thousands and thousands of submissions. I received tons of interest from people like, top to bottom, from like, low follower accounts who, were just starting off on Twitter, to people who have like an established presence and name, not just like on our little Twitter sphere, but
Mm.
in the culture more broadly. And, I want to be discreet about who these people are, but it really did generate a ton of interest across the spectrum. And what I'd say is that, I had a particular thing in mind when I was looking at this. And one thing it's this curious thing where I don't want to fall into the trap of, conquest law, where anything that isn't explicitly right wing just becomes liberal over time. And I'm very cognizant of that potential trap. But at the
Mm.
same time, I really just don't think, as a principle, art ought to be created from the starting place of ideology or politics. And if that's your starting place, where you're trying to make some kind of political argument or advance some kind of ideological agenda, it's going to probably be bad art. I'm sure there's exception to this, and I can be proven wrong, like one in a one-off case here or there, but that can't be the sort of driver of the art. So one thing I was looking for was like stories, poetry, whatever, that didn't have this kind of like heavy-handed political or ideological approach.
Mm.
But to whatever extent these stories or this art expressed what might be interpreted as a sort of right-coded idea or vision, or set of interests or values, was just a product of that art saying or expressing something true. And I mean like capital T true, in this grander sense, this sort of spiritual trueness about it, which is what makes so much left-wing art so bad, is that it's just merely propaganda. It's
Right.
not true. It doesn't look at the world in this kind of unflinching way. It tries to dress it up and ignore certain things and elevate certain aspects of the world that aren't as true or don't pass this test of verisimilitude. And so, okay, so I was looking for stuff that's true. And then, stuff that by virtue of being true is also insightful, this thing called beauty, whatever that might mean, that is uh interesting. So that's something that kind of knocks us out of our preconceived notions about what these different forms ought to look like. And this gets back to my interest in thinking about conservative art as being avant-garde,
Mm.
and not wanting us to just fill in this kind of paint by numbers fashion, these old ways of doing things, but actually establish new forms, new ways of telling stories, new ways of thinking about the world. Because after all, the sort of digital landscape that we're in, we're all on the internet, we're connected in these weird ways, is going to produce different realities for us to be thinking about. And just old ways of doing things aren't going to be sufficient for these new circumstances. Okay, so not political, that's doing something new or interesting in a kind of avant-garde fashion, and then is skilled. Okay, that this is the other thing,
Yeah.
is like what you see online in our space is a lot of really raw talent, which is great, but it's super important that we also impose some discipline on ourselves and become experts at our craft. And I wanted work that demonstrated a certain technical proficiency. Now, I wasn't able to achieve all of these things in all cases, and I selected some work that was sort of what we might call naive art, or really green raw art, and that was fine. And then
Mm.
I might have selected in other cases stuff that was more traditional, wasn't as avant-garde, but as a whole, I was trying in this book to sort of capture those qualities. Um, so And I think, I hope I succeeded. I don't, we did as good as we could under the circumstances, I think. And this reception was great. People, we were able to sell a lot of copies. We were able to generate enough interest, like I said, to do the second prize.
Hmm.
So I'd have to say it was a success on the whole, but I'm not really the person to judge that, honestly.
Well, I guess maybe history will judge it.
Yeah, right.
I can imagine, these books going for. I mean, I'm sure they're already going for a lot on the secondary market if you can
Yeah,
find
they
them.
are they are being sold on the secondary market, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah,
And exciting. Yeah.
because they all have limited print runs, especially the hardcovers.
Yeah,
And
we did that on purpose. I mean,
right.
I wanted to create some scarcity around this thing, and I had a few motivations for keeping it fairly scarce because I was asking a lot of the buyers of this thing because I used the sale of the book to fund the second prize. And
Mm.
so, I raised the price a great deal from what it could have been sold for. It's almost like a Kickstarter campaign, okay? Like you buy into a project and then you get this like special thing out of it. Because it's something you believe in, it's a community you want to support. So that was kind of the idea behind it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm at a stage now where before this I wasn't living. I was living in a, let's just say, less affluent part of the country, and
Huh.
I'm at a place now where I go over to people's houses occasionally, and I'll see like the Passage Prize books on the shelf, and it's sort of
That's
like a
cool.
trophy that they have.
That's really cool.
They're able
That's
to
really
collect
cool to
these,
hear.
um, and it also is like a nice subtle signal, that
Yeah.
you're among friends. But anyway, so were you surprised by any of the work that you found compelling, or by anything that was, I mean, maybe even rejected from the initial print run?
Yeah, I mean, I could go through the litany of all the names of people who wrote stuff that I was really impressed by, and I'll spare you the boredom of that. There were so many, but there were a handful of real standouts. And the person who won first prize for art and second prize were both incredible artists, are both incredible artists who just produced some really stunning work. Y Dog, who's on
Mm.
Twitter at @YDogArt, and a guy named Zach Brown, who doesn't have much of a Twitter presence, but I mean, like just gorgeous pieces of art. In the writing, there was a fiction writer named V.N. Ebert, who again, I no idea who this person was not aware of their Twitter persona. Handed a story in that was just like really, really good. And I've since now received a manuscript from him for a short story collection that we're going to be publishing this year, actually, which
Mm.
has been pretty exciting. Um, and then in the second volume, similar thing. Like we got some stuff from writers. Justin Lee is one. He's got a collection of short stories coming out from us as well, like a modern horror writer. Um, we got some really, really great art and poetry and some essay writing as well. Yeah, I mean, it'd just be me, like kind of like
Mm.
this guy Charles Wing. I'm gonna mispronounce it. Yüksel. I don't know how to pronounce it. Um, Online, really great essayist, really interesting things to say. So yeah, I was really pleased by some of the quality of work. Now, the thing that most impressed me though was the fact that it wasn't just like one or two people that I expected it from. Like there are these big Twitter accounts, for example, and they're good writers and you kind of expect them to turn in some good stuff. It was
Mm.
the fact that some of the really good stuff came from people like completely out of the blue, people I'd never heard of before,
Yeah.
um, who demonstrated this tremendous skill and talent on the page. And that was something that was really heartening to see because it indicated to me that there's this massive reservoir of untapped talent out there on our side. And that if we were just to give them a chance and to be a little bit more open in this space about what kinds of art and writing um, we were allowed to sort of celebrate and read, I think was a white pill for sure.
Yeah. So in that regard, with respect to, finding new artists, and you talked a little bit about this in the, I guess, the closing posts of the Passage Prize. Would you say that, it was a success, that you sort of laid the groundwork for a number of these names to continue writing, continue publishing, that there's been, I guess a discoverability problem has been solved for now?
Yeah, in some sense, the discoverability problem has been solved. Although what although that's not no, I wouldn't say it's been solved. It's sort of been like we did what we could in this limited time frame to bring these
Mm,
people out and draw out some talent that I don't think we would have otherwise discovered. And what we'll continue to discover are the writers who are also good posters. And by virtue of being good posters, they'll be able to get their name out there and share like their longer work and get exposure for their longer work. But there's also this class of artists and writers who are really, really good at what they do, but probably aren't very good posters. And so this question remains like, how do we find them? And one thing that's come out of Passage Prize, and I should say up front, I'm not sure if you're aware of this. This is going to be our last year doing it, at least
yeah.
for now.
Hmm.
We're moving into like some other ground. We're going to do like a novel contest, for example, to take the place of Passage Prize next year.
Yeah.
Um, but what's happened is there are some other now like prizes, anthologies. Rye Nationalists just closed down a pulp fiction writing contest. I think Antelope Hill has a fiction contest going on. There are some others out there. There's some other like small little literary magazines that are sprouting up here and there. So
Hmm.
I think what's happening, and I don't think Passage Prize is the cause. It just sort of was there at the beginning of this wave where this, and like a lot of people were, I think, aware of this burgeoning energy. And so now I think we're starting to populate this space with several little gardens where people can sort of showcase their talents you know um, and cultivate like their own tastes and their own styles, which I think is really good.
Yeah. So, you know, obviously you hinted at, moving on from the prize as sort of your main focus. You established the Passage Press, which came out of all of this, which is a
Yeah,
publishing company.
yeah,
And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about, things going on with the Passage Press. You guys are doing a lot. Obviously, the partnership with Man's World is
yeah,
very exciting, and everyone is celebrating that. But there's also a number of books and anthologies and other things you've published.
yeah,
The book with Steve Saylor, which
yeah.
is being promoted by Will Stansel and friends,
Yes.
um, as
Yeah,
well
our head
as
of PR, Will Stansel.
right, as well as after the war, you published Unqualified Reservation. So could you just talk a little bit about sort of the publishing arm of Passage Press and the direction for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this is where I'm starting to devote my resources and energy because for a variety of complicated reasons and where I'm at in my life, this is something that I want to try to be a little bit more ambitious with than previous projects that I've embarked on. And I think the opportunity's there. I think the time is right. Publishing in general is kind of in secular decline.
Hmm.
Everything is getting swallowed up by the big five publishers, except any kind of imprint or writing that is sort of conservative right wing coded. Okay, for
Right.
reasons that I'm sure you could guess.
Oh, that's
And
so
so there's this,
interesting. There's a
yeah,
hole in the market.
there's a hole in the market. Yeah. And so, okay. And then you ask the question, all right, well, ordinarily when there's a hole in the market, there's like a lot of smart, enterprising people there to fill it.
Mm,
And what's interesting about publishing is like, uh, younger than the boomers, like outside of the boomers, there's just nobody there. And so I got to talking with some people who have been in publishing for a long time and know the ins and outs in publishing. We thought, okay, there's an opportunity here. And I love the sort of like right-wing dissident publishing sphere, but if I may just for a second like say about it, what it is mostly is people taking writing, and then putting it through the print on demand grid
Right.
from Amazon or Ingram. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's like totally fine. But to do traditional publishing, you need to tap into a larger network of service providers and what are called offset printers. And there's an entire distribution element to publishing that our guys really haven't been able to get into. And this plagues like right-wing musicians and filmmakers too, even like major ones like Amanda Milius or something. She
Hmm.
can't get distribution, so she has to rely on just selling her, documentaries on Amazon or something. She's had a lot of luck with that, but there's a sort of ceiling on how much reach you can get using that model. Okay, so what we want to do is stand up what amounts to a traditional publisher and go through the entire suite of production elements from editing to distribution to warehousing to what we have our direct sales channel, but we want to get books in bookstores. We're going to, we want to see Steve Saylor's book in university libraries and wherever books are sold, as the old
Hmm.
saying goes, airport bookshelves. Why not? I mean, it belongs there. It ought to be there.
Yeah, read
And
noticing
so
right before you get on the plane
yeah, that's
with
right.
your
Why
new
not?
DI pilots and air traffic controllers.
Yeah. So our goal is to do this, and it's an ambitious goal. And there's a lot of headwinds that are tracking against us, but it's not undoable. And so anyway, so this is a long way of saying that what we're going to be doing is we're going to continue publishing under Passage. We're going to be looking to acquire other imprints and other publishers in our space and create a little bit of because what you need is volume
Yeah.
to get into some of this distribution game. And so we're going to start accumulating and we're going to start getting into, genre fiction and hopefully science fiction here pretty soon. And we'd like to also begin to get some exposure into what more normie audiences. And that's not to dilute our offerings, but to offer a bit of a carrot for, audiences who might be a little spooked or just, the names like Nick Land and Steve Saylor and Curtis Yarvin just mean nothing to them.
Hmm.
And so how do you get them into the tent? And it might be by offering them, some of these bridge personalities that can bring them in. And so that's something that we're going to be working on and going after some authors who can help in that regard and create what, hopefully will be 20 years from now, like the conservative publisher of record, which I don't know how much you pay attention to publishing, probably not much, but Regnery Publishing was that for a very long time, from about the 70s, 60s onward. They were kind of the conservative house publisher, and they were bought 3 months ago at the end of 2023 by Skyhorse Publishing, which is just a kind of huge collection of just everything. It's not a conservative publisher at all.
Mm.
So it just doesn't exist. There's nothing else there. And with a lot of luck, I should say, but working hard and finding the right partners, that's our goal, is to kind of slot ourselves in that space and slowly cross-pollinate the ideas percolating out of our space, like our Twitter space, with the ideas in a more normie space. And as the boomers kind of phase out, we think that's where the direction is anyway. That's where like conservative media is going anyway. I mean, you
Yeah,
look
for sure.
around at these magazines, like
They don't
those
have the
big
youth at
names are
all.
adopting our ideas, not the other way around,
Yeah.
and there's a reason for that.
I mean, one comment, I guess before I go into my next question is like the I've started to really notice that a lot lately. Just the the ideas that have been percolating since like even pre 2016
Yeah.
now making their way into like normie conservative culture and media. And
Yeah.
it's kind of funny because a lot of anons get mad about it because they're like, oh, they're they're chasing clout off of our stuff that we were
Yeah.
doing, 5 years ago that was unacceptable or whatever. But I'm like, well, you're winning. Like you're complaining about winning is what you're doing right now.
This is what winning looks like.
Yeah.
Trump had that line like, we're going to win so much, you're going to get tired of winning.
Yeah.
And
Right.
he's right that winning is actually kind of tedious and
Hmm.
it gets boring and it loses some of the excitement and you lose some of the like frisson of being edgy or a dissident because all of a sudden the things you were saying like 3 or 4 years ago that were quote unquote edgy, you're hearing like Tucker say to the largest national TV audience in the country, or you're hearing like your local, right wing radio host just saying as if it's just, a normal talking point.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's kind of cringe. And I don't mean this about like Tucker specifically, but sometimes you hear this stuff come out of their mouths and you're like, okay, I wouldn't say it quite like that, or you're diluting it a little bit, but I'm sorry, guys, that's just what it looks like. When these ideas start to hit critical mass, that's just what a preference cascade looks like. And you got to, there's always going to be a vanguard and a
Hmm.
kind of right edge. And the like, if that's the role you think you want to play, or you just naturally fit in, fine. But it's okay to kind of win in a boring fashion too. At least I'm getting older, so maybe I'm just becoming like an old man or
Well,
something.
I had a tweet about this the other day that was basically like, there's always going to be the avant-garde and then there's going to be the popularizers. And
Yeah,
what's going on with this is that the avant-garde are looking at the popularizers who are taking their ideas and then getting mad that they're not the popularizers.
yeah,
But it's like they're like two different species of creatures,
yeah.
and almost nobody is good at being both.
Right.
And you can't be both simultaneously either.
Well,
Some
you can't. That's
very
right. Yeah,
few people can do both in sequence, but not
yeah.
simultaneously.
That's right. That's exactly right. They're two totally different nodes, or like you said, creatures in this ecosystem, and
Mm,
they play two totally different roles, and they can't be cannibalizing each other. Like they have to exist independently, and even somewhat antagonistically, and that's okay. Like a little bit of tension there is fine, but you don't want to get in the thing where you're doing this sort of self-defeating infighting,
yeah.
which can also happen when the and this is what happens when the focus becomes on the egos and the personalities rather than and you lose track of like what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Well, there's also
And
like a vice test. I wouldn't call it a
yeah,
purity test. It's like a vice test where,
yeah,
when they're complaining that someone is popularizing your memes and but then like sanitizing them a little bit or watering them down or whatever. It's like your complaint is basically that they're not being like evil enough, that
right,
that they're
right.
that they're actually trying to have good optics. And
Yeah, yeah.
um
Yeah, and the other part of this too, and I've seen it a little bit, is there's only so much money to go around, and I think that's actually I think that's wrong, but the
mhm,
perception is there's only so much money to go around. So there's kind of like a zero sum game that you're playing against other quote unquote influencers or audiences, where if someone you perceive as a competitor in your space is succeeding, that means that somehow you're going to be losing out on audience share and the ability to sort of make money. And when people commit themselves to this thing as a career,
mhm.
as a way of making money, it completely distorts their incentives and their way of thinking about this ecosystem and how the different people in the ecosystem kind of need each other and feed off each other. Um, so that's part of it too. And you know, I would say in their defense, like, yes, conservative money doesn't move with the same velocity that left money does. The left throws money around in a way that would just make like right wingers' heads spin.
Mhm.
Right, the right does throw money around, but it's very narrowly focused. The left will just pour millions and millions of dollars into the stupidest projects and like just on complete whims. Um, so there is an asymmetry there about how about like the money velocity in these two different ecosystems.
Yeah. Well, why not just make money doing something else and then
Yeah,
pour? you can do the Charles Haywood route, right? Like make all your money and then pour it into uh,
Yeah. We
your
should
own
all do that. We should all
projects.
become shampoo warlords
Yeah, exactly.
and then, return to Twitter in our, 50s or whatever in our and lead.
And
No,
just
I
start
mean,
posting.
yeah, like look, I actually think that's right. I don't think people should try to make right-wing discourse into their careers.
Mm.
I am not really one to be speaking on that at the moment. I never intended to do this, but at least for now, it did occur to me though, like if you do want to do a serious big project, like start a big publishing house that tries to take on like bigger publishers, it does need to be a full-time job. Like you need to
Yeah.
drop everything else you're doing and do it. So if you do have a big project, yeah. If it's just podcasting and Substacks, oh well, what the hell? I mean, do whatever you want to do. Actually, I'm not going to tell people what to do. It's just um you might find your incentives misaligned if you do that because you're chasing after these audience dollars rather than focusing on actually like accomplishing certain kinds of goals. And so that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. I'm not going to toot my own horn too much on this, but like, there's a reason this show is not doesn't have a explicit ideological framing, and that's
Yeah.
because like it's not the kind of audience or direction that we're aiming towards. And similar to what you were describing as far as the political messaging that you were looking for, or the lack thereof, I guess, in the Passage Prize works. It's like if there is kind of any values in there at all, the goal is for them to sort of be latent variables.
Yeah.
Um, and then the people that like your stuff will slowly catch on to the underlying, I guess, uh, I don't want to call it ideology because it's not ideological, but the underlying principles and values that are within the body of work.
Yeah, that's right. It becomes unavoidable at some point. And so yeah, I agree with that completely. I just think that we don't need to come into these projects ideology first for the reasons you described. So yeah, I'm on board with that 100%.
So you acquired Mystery Grove's catalog.
Hmm. Hmm.
What was that about?
So yeah, Mystery Grove, it's a bunch of different people embarked on this project back in 2018, maybe I
Mhm.
want to say, maybe
That
slightly
sounds right.
before that. And they were just kind of moving in different directions in terms of life stage, and they had succeeded in building out this interesting project and reviving this work and bringing to the fore certain kinds of ideas and authors that they thought were important. And, they just decided to go out on a high note. They were looking around for someone to help steward their catalogs. They didn't want it to die. They just didn't want to be like directly involved with it on a day-to-day basis. And I was able to sort of make some contact with them and had a discussion with them about what that might look like on an ongoing basis. And we came to an agreement about what to do with these titles. And then going forward, how we're going to take that initial catalog and build out from there, like following the same set of sort of aesthetic principles and interests that Mystery Grove had initially established with their own catalog. And so to
Mm.
that end, for example, right, should be this week, although it may be next week. I was just doing some editing on it when we started our call. We have a collection of short stories coming out from H.P. Lovecraft, like the original H.P. Lovecraft, the H.P. Lovecraft Masterworks with some great original art and some cool design features. Later in the year, we have a three-part anthology coming out from Robert E. Howard
Mm.
of Conan fame, another great sort of pulp writer from similar era. And in fact, him and Lovecraft were buddies. They were like pen pals. Um, we have some great works in nonfiction coming out under that line that kind of follow in the trajectory of the Mystery Grove catalog, almost like real life pulp, Peter Kemp style, like war stories,
Mm.
French Foreign Legion, Algerian war stuff. Some really great stuff from World War II. We got some great like pulpy nonfiction from the 80s from some old presses that are no longer in existence, but
Oh,
you know,
wow.
you may be familiar with like Paladin Press or something like that. So
Mm,
stuff like that. So we're just going to be re-releasing older stuff under that imprint. We're going to try to do somewhere in the range of like 5 to 6 books a year.
okay.
So yeah, that's the idea.
So that sounds to me like it's in line with sort of the idea of like just appealing to a more broader audience by bringing in sort of more of these classic
Yes.
works, war
Yeah,
stories, you know.
it's definitely broadening the audience. And then also the way we're thinking about it too, it's kind of reestablishing a canon
Mhm.
for like our guys,
Right.
like almost like a curriculum. Like, okay, here are all the books that you ought to be reading. And it's a little bit different than the kinds of stuff you see get memed on like Twitter and stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with that stuff, but like, you know, there are other people putting out like Evola and Spangler and that kind of stuff. So we're trying to offer more just like, you know, historical nonfiction, some good like classic literature, you know, Conrad, Younger, you know, the Lovecraft, the pulp stuff, things of that nature. um and so yeah, it's the idea too is that, you know, at least our modern history, if you look at the history of the 20th century, the sort of received history of the 20th century, the kind of thing you learn in like, you know, your high school history class, it's a very sort of potted history that um it allied certain events. And we're not even, it's not even about doing a kind of revisionist history. Again, we're going to like leave that to others. You know, we're not going to really get into that space much. But there's a lot of stuff that it just leaves out. So it leaves
Mm,
out a ton of stuff about like the Russian Civil War or the rise of Bolshevism in general. Um, you hear about Weimar, for example, but you don't really tend to hear the story about how you go from World War One to Weimar and
mm,
why, you know, how Weimar arose and why. And it's actually kind of an interesting history. And like guys on our side get it wrong too, which is like the right in Germany actually welcomed Weimar because it was perceived as a kind of antidote to Bolshevism.
mhm,
Um, and so anyway, what we're trying to do is kind of just reestablish our kind of 20th century mythos and refocus people's interest on some of these what we're calling obscured episodes of history. It's not that they're obscure, they're like weird or offbeat. It's just that they've been sort of neglected or hidden from view for a variety of complicated reasons.
mm. Yeah, and also, I mean, I'm sensing at least from the way you described the difference between you and some of the other stuff that gets picked up. Sorry, my lighting here is changing all of a sudden.
All good.
Is it seems a little grittier too. Like, you know, I come from like a political theory tradition, so I'm
Okay.
fine like reading my Spangler and reading my Evola and doing the sort of highfalutin
Yeah.
philosophy angle. But I would say, you know, the average dude, I mean, our guys are pretty smart, but I even still, the stuff that they're excited about or the stuff that they want to spend a lot of time reading is not necessarily going to be um uh I don't know, The Decline of the West or something like that, which is an absolute tome. You know,
Yeah.
maybe they want to get into something that's a little bit less abstract, a little bit less you know, discursive and
Yes.
just as, you know, exciting and thrilling and gives them a vision for a kind of um vital life that they could be having.
Yeah, that's right. So you know, and for us, I think honestly, it's going to be a mix of both. And you know, we'll do some of that more um, high abstract sort of theory and philosophy. And there are some names that you know we'll probably um, come out with. And you know, there's like, look, in the back of Unqualified Reservations, we were putting together the first volume of Unqualified Reservations. We decided to put a like a reading list back there. You know,
Mm,
all these books that Curtis references throughout the thing, and it's
yeah.
like you could just write a curriculum based on that stuff alone, and it's all super interesting. But it's like Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, really,
go
what
read the
is
Machiavellians, go read some Chesterton.
yeah, and like Carlisle and all this stuff, and it's like great, De Maestro, all these people, but how many people really? What is the audience for the amount of people who want to like wade through that stuff?
Mhm.
And I'm not saying it's because it's not important. I'm just saying, yeah, like there is other stuff, and I'm trying to. Okay, um, have you read Bap's book?
Yeah, of course.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so in Bronze
Which I
Age mindset,
denounce. I denounce, by the
yeah,
way.
me too. Me, of course. Um, but he talks about all these figures, these like historical figures, Mad Mike Ore, for example, okay, that like you said, they offer this like model for an interesting life and
Mm,
like a life well lived and a kind of life and really just an attitude toward life that I think a lot of us sort of stuck in our modern pods and cubicles and trying to scrape our way out of bug life would do well to sort of emulate or at least have as a kind of aspirational goal. Like there is a higher form of life that we can sort of seek to achieve. Okay, so the idea would be let's find guys like that. Peter Kemp, or
mm,
this is what people love about Ernst Junger's writing, Storm of Steel. It's like it's not because it's political, it has nothing to do with people's attitudes toward World War I or their sort of belief about whether Germany was in the right or whatever. It's completely orthogonal to that. It's just
mm.
this fascinating figure, this young guy who's having this sort of euphoric time in World War I. And yeah, we want to find similar figures. And so that is definitely part of what we're doing. And just stories in general, like
Yeah.
guns and bombs and action and pretty ladies and intrigue and espionage. It's just fun, man. This is this other thing where it's let's not be afraid of like lowbrow stuff either.
Great.
Like just having fun and entertaining ourselves. So yeah, that's part of it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me at least, I'm still a young man, but I was younger when I first started encountering this stuff, and the subculture is like it. One of the messages that you get it from Bap's book, you get it from other sources too, is uh is like you don't know how domesticated of an animal you've become really until you
Yeah.
figure out that like, oh, actually you can step out. It's sort of like there was a video going around Twitter a couple weeks ago of like the bear who was kept in a cage his whole life.
Oh yeah.
And then he's set free in a nature preserve, but he keeps circling in the same
I
spot
saw
over
that,
and over
man.
again.
It's so sad. I
Yeah,
wanted to cry when I saw that.
yeah, it's horrible. But what I'm saying is, I think one of the good things about encountering these kind of lives that people have lived, or this kind of material, even mythological versions of it, is that you get an idea that like, oh, you could actually be a lot more expansive than you are,
Yes.
if you chose to. But a lot of people, no one's ever told them that. Literally, it wasn't even considered as a possibility, um, for most of their lives, unless they were lucky and had some exceptional male role models around who were doing interesting things. But frankly, in today's life, there aren't a lot of good examples of those. And there's a sort of adventurous man, sort of the Foreign Legion type character, and that as an archetype is just totally dying out.
Yeah.
Partly maybe because there aren't as many opportunities, but also in a way the programming is just so intense that uh, you can't go do that. You have to, there's a kind of yoke that's put on all people, young men especially, that there's this system and you just have to find your place in it and shut up and be
Yeah.
quiet and watch TV.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, so it's even worse than just um like you can't do these things. There's also this feeling that you ought not to, even if you could. So
Yeah.
that there's something morally defective about like a young man who just wants to sort of lean into this kind of reckless adventure spirit. And I'm on the other side of that, given my life stage at the moment. And I had my what I call my Odyssey years where I was out in the world just like on an adventure, and it was great and important for me. And I was no, Mad Mike Ori or like, French Foreign Legion fighter or something. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It was very tepid, very like tame version, very like soy millennial version of that. Okay.
Mm.
But um it's also the case that when I want to do some like fantasy projection, I don't want to watch like a Marvel movie. Like I want to
Yeah.
imagine myself as a young man, like going out and doing what these guys did. And if that's all it is too, that's fine. Like it allows for the imagination, the expansion of the imagination, an understanding of what is possible in a way that is otherwise closed off from us. And I think that's good enough on its own. It doesn't even, what I'm saying is, it doesn't necessarily even have to inspire action.
Mm.
It's just enough that it opens up the imaginative horizons for someone to think about what could be possible. That is itself a kind of liberation, from bug life in some sense. It's not complete, but it's part of it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree more. So you've talked a little bit about what's next for Passage Prize. Obviously, I'm sorry, Passage Press. Um,
Yeah.
the final prize, I believe, is still taking submissions right now. Is that right?
Yeah, through mid-March. So we
Okay.
uh we extended the date to the first day of spring, which I want to say is the 17th.
Hmm. All right. So you have to submit, those of you who are
Yes, you
listening. You
must
must.
submit $20,000 in prizes, a
Mhm.
chance to get your name etched in history forever. I expect there's going to be some really good stuff in this one because I've been going around like quietly, sort of like tapping people who I know are good writers on the shoulder, being like, just submit, submit, submit. So I'm hoping to
Yeah.
get some really good stuff, but I also want to see some new stuff. I want to see stuff from people I've never heard of. And, like I said before, I'm really interested in people who are pushing the boundaries on art, like doing stuff that's a little bit more avant-garde, that's interesting, that's difficult. I don't want to say transgressive because that word gets misused and sort of misunderstood, but nonetheless, takes seriously the duty of an artist to sort of reconfigure the world and their understanding of the world in a way that hasn't been done before, to do
Mm.
something that is novel, and I want to see that.
Yeah. So please submit. You must submit
You must
to
submit.
the last Passage Prize, which is closing soon. And you hinted in the post about this that there's some possibility that the prize could be brought back in the future if the need so arises, or I
Yeah.
guess if the press gets the bandwidth. Uh, do you think that's more contingent on circumstances with the press, or is it sort of a need based thing? I'm not asking you to make a commitment here, but
Yeah.
I am
No,
curious.
it's 100% just like my bandwidth.
Mhm.
There's only so much I can do in a day, in a week, in a year. And given all this other stuff I want to do with Passage and this opportunity for expansion I see right now, something had to give there.
Yeah,
And Passage Prize, as people who would know, people who've done stuff like this, and certainly the judges who I've deployed for this, it is a massive lift, man. And I'm not saying this to try to elicit any sympathy or anything, but it's just a huge time suck.
mm,
And going through all the submissions, collating everything, doing all the editing that needs to be done, which is pretty substantial. Then putting it into a book, designing, doing interior design and getting it ready for print and all that stuff is just, it's my whole life basically from the time submissions are due up until the day the book comes out. And
mm,
I just can't do it. I'm in a rope. I just I need a break.
mm.
So yeah, so that's the real answer is it could come back if at some point like I'm able to hire someone or someone else wants to take this on, just because they want to do it and are interested and have the talent and capacity to do it, I would hand it over probably. But for now, there's no way I can do it.
Hmm. All right. Well, you hear it. It's the last chance
Yeah.
for some time at least. I do hope that it will come back and that you'll find the means to bring it back. But last thing I wanted to just briefly let you touch on is, the future of Passage Press, because Passage Press itself is not going away. You're committing more towards sort of the long form novels, other publications. What can people look forward to with the press?
Yeah. So we have, gosh, I think at least six more books coming out this year. We
Wow.
have the Lovecraft, we have the Howard collection I mentioned earlier. We have a Nick Land book that's coming out. We have two short story collections this year, one from V.N. Ebert, another from Justin Lee, who are previous Passage Prize winners. We have a novel, our first novel coming out from this guy named Jack Spiezio, which is great. It's like this Victorian era academic rom-com. It's
Mm,
totally different than something I expected to see, but it's just like this kind of funny light novel about this American who goes to study classics over at Oxford and gets offered this teaching position there. And he has this kind of love affair and whatever. And it deals with a lot of issues related to British aristocracy, England versus America, ideas of what is a nation, what is nationalism, what is home, like stuff that's very relevant now. Anyway, that'll be coming out. Then next year I'm putting together a slate of books coming out. I don't want to say anything too soon because we don't have contracts signed for all those. So I just don't want to put anyone in an awkward position. But we got a bunch of books coming out over the next couple of years that I think people are going to be really excited for. We got new classics coming out. We hope to have this sci-fi imprint up and running very soon. And we have Man's World. So I'd love people to subscribe to Man's World, which I think is going to be great. I think it's going to be a print publication,
mm,
which will in some sense carry on some of the legacy of Passage Prize by publishing new work, fiction, essays, etc.
yeah.
So yeah, man, I'm sure there's stuff I'm leaving out. Oh, well, and I should say too, we're hosting a series of in-person events
Oh, wow.
for the Steve Saylor tour.
Oh, yes, of
We're gonna
course.
be Yeah, we're gonna be going around the country with Saylor. We have these private events, but we're also doing public-facing events in LA, Austin, Miami, and New York
Mm,
over the next 3 months. So starting end of March through the first week of May. And so if people want information about those public events, you can check out our website and you can buy tickets there, and we'll have more information on that soon. And so, yeah, we're trying to push some of this stuff out into the real world. And, we're mindful of people's OPSEC. So, do what you need to do to be careful and be comfortable. But for people who want to get out there and meet people and, we're gonna try to provide some opportunities to do that.
all right. Well, Lomez, it's been wonderful catching up with you and meeting you for the first time. And I'm excited for everything that's going on with the Passage Press and also in-person events. I had forgotten about the noticing tour.
Yeah.
Um, Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. This was great, man. Appreciate it.